The man was meticulously polishing the antique table he had just purchased when he accidentally discovered a hidden compartment. Carefully opening it, he pulled out a thick stack of letters. As he read through them, he realized they were a diary from 100 years ago. Little did anyone know that at this very moment a century ago, a woman skillfully opened a drawer, reached inside, and pressed a hidden mechanism. The same compartment sprang open, but to her astonishment, she found her diary had vanished. She would never have imagined that 100 years later, a man named Carl would be intently reading her diary. The entries revealed her name was Annie, born into an aristocratic family. Her family insisted she marry a man she did not love. Though she longed to resist, she felt powerless. In that era, women had no say in choosing their own spouses. Carl grew increasingly captivated as he read, feeling as though he had been transported to the diary writer's side. Thus began an extraordinary love story that transcended time. Deeply moved by Annie's plight, Carl hurriedly opened his laptop and poured out his thoughts. He discussed the matter with his mother, who surprisingly suggested something romantic. She encouraged him to try writing a letter to the woman from a century ago. She even produced a stamp from over 100 years ago and told Carl to use it to send the letter from the only post office that had remained operational for a century. Though he found the idea absurd, Carl felt an inexplicable urge to write the letter. He advised Annie to pursue true love and even playfully hinted that her soulmate might be waiting 100 years in the future. He couldn't help but laugh at his own words. Later that night, he drove to the post office his mother had mentioned, only to find it deserted. With no other options, he slipped the letter into the only mailbox available. Then, something miraculous happened. A young maid from 100 years ago actually received the letter. Meanwhile, Annie was on a date with the man she disliked. After a long day of forced socializing, she finally returned home and absent-mindedly opened the letter on her table. Stunned by its contents, she rushed to the hidden compartment in her desk and discovered that her diary had indeed disappeared. At the same time, Carl was watching a soccer game on TV when he heard a strange noise nearby. Puzzled, he walked over to the antique table and opened the hidden compartment. To his amazement, he found a letter inside even though he had emptied it earlier. Overjoyed and curious, he immediately opened it. The letter was filled with Annie's questions and doubts about his identity. Carl had never imagined he would actually make contact with someone across time. He promptly wrote back explaining everything. When Annie learned she was communicating with a man from the future, her emotions were in turmoil. She kept the secret from her family and began exchanging letters frequently with Carl. Annie was eager to learn about life in the future, and Carl patiently described everything, even teaching her how to bake a cake through his letters. Though they had never met, a unique warmth blossomed in their hearts. Annie's smiles became more frequent, and she looked forward to Carl's letters every day. Wanting to know more about Annie and feel closer to her, Carl drove to the address mentioned in her letters. The villa where she once lived was still there, but only a maid remained. The aristocratic family had clearly declined. An elderly woman's voice called out from upstairs, and the maid explained that she was Annie's descendant, her granddaughter. Carl eagerly asked about Annie, but the woman was reluctant to share details. Disappointed, Carl turned to leave. As he descended the stairs, something magical happened. Annie from 100 years ago was walking up the same staircase. Though invisible to each other, they sensed one another's presence and cautiously reached out to touch. To their astonishment, they could feel each other. Just then, the maid's voice broke the connection. But the indescribable magic of that moment was forever etched in their hearts. Carl rushed home and wrote to Annie about everything that had happened. Annie eagerly read the letter, her lips curling into a smile at his familiar writing and the tenderness in his words. What she never expected was that their touch had not been an illusion. As she silently wiped away tears, she longed to meet the man she loved. To see each other clearly, they agreed to exchange photos. Annie dressed elegantly and had her picture taken, capturing her most beautiful self. Carl was overjoyed when he saw it. However, the photo Carl sent was accidentally dropped by a servant and never reached Annie. Anxious at the lack of response, Annie decided to travel to Carl's city to recreate the moment they had touched. She confided in her most trusted sister, instructing her to place any letters from her into the hidden compartment. But as Annie rode her carriage through the woods, Carl, who was participating in a bicycle race, suddenly crashed. Though he sustained no serious injuries, he fell into a coma, baffling doctors. Meanwhile, Annie arrived in Carl's city. In a chance encounter, she locked eyes with a general she had never met before, yet felt an instant connection with. They strolled together in a light drizzle, and when the general offered his arm, she naturally took it. Though it seemed unbelievable, Annie sensed Carl's presence in the general. The two grew fond of each other and went on a date by the lake, enjoying a peaceful boat ride. Annie documented everything in her letters, and a beautiful love story quietly unfolded. However, their happiness was short-lived. At a ball, the general informed her that he had been ordered to the front lines. They agreed to meet that evening at a pavilion. Though heartbroken, Annie put on a brave smile for her beloved. They embraced, silently vowing to spend their lives together. Meanwhile, Carl suddenly woke up in the hospital. He eagerly read the letters in the hidden compartment, learning about Annie and the general's love story. He was genuinely happy for her. But upon discovering that the general would die in battle on July 3rd, and realizing Annie's last letter was dated June 28th, Carl urgently wrote to her, begging her to prevent the tragedy. To his horror, the post office caught fire that very night. Determined to save Annie from heartbreak, Carl rushed into the flames and managed to drop the letter into the mailbox. Annie anxiously opened the letter and was devastated to learn of the general's impending death. She immediately raced off in her carriage to the front lines. When she arrived, she was told that the general's unit had been nearly wiped out. Frantic, she searched through the wounded soldiers and finally found the general, covered in blood and on the verge of death. He drew his last breath in her arms. 100 years later, Carl jolted awake from a dream, overwhelmed with sorrow as if he had just experienced a heartbreaking farewell. Annie returned home numb with grief and wrote to Carl about everything. Carl longed to comfort her, but with the post office in ashes, he felt helpless. His mother urged him to return to reality, but his heart belonged only to Annie. Later, a servant found Carl's lost photo on the floor. Annie finally realized Carl had never stopped writing to her, and a faint smile returned to her lips. But when she opened the envelope and saw the photo, she was stunned. Carl looked exactly like the general. It was as if fate had destined their souls to find each other across a century in the most extraordinary way. Carl eventually received another letter in the hidden compartment. He was equally shocked to see an old photo inside. He immediately drove to Annie's former home, holding flowers as he made his way to her gravesite. Gently tracing the epitaph and reading her vow of unwavering love, tears welled in his eyes. Just then, a dog happily bounded up to him, followed by its owner, who rushed over to apologize. But when Carl saw the owner's face, he stood frozen in place. It was the spitting image of Annie.